Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
I'm so glad you're joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers. I'm your host, Lisa Evers. Right now, we're taking a fresh look at marijuana use and whether we've been told the truth about its effects and its impact on our health and our communities. We see people smoking in public at all times of the day and night. And with marijuana now legalized or decriminalized in more than 30 states, we think it's time for a deeper look at what's really going on. International superstar and Time Magazine Icon of the Year, Elton John, made headlines talking about his past battle with drug addiction. He said marijuana was a gateway drug for him and that the legalization of marijuana in the United States is one of the greatest mistakes of all time. Some now say the marijuana gold rush, a multi-billion-dollar industry in which about 13% of U.S. adults use, is moving too far, too fast.
I'm going to agree also with what Elton John said. I think legalization has been a huge detriment to public health when you have a substance that is addictive, that does have negative consequences.
For a long time, many believe marijuana, also called cannabis, was not habit forming. But researchers at Yale School of Medicine found that 10% of users will become addicted. There's now a condition called cannabis use disorder, where they say cannabis may have harmful long and short-term effects, such as paranoia and memory loss. There's also a condition becoming more prevalent called cannabis-induced psychosis, which can result from just one use. It's a growing concern, especially with teens and young adults under 25, says Dr. Yalda Safai.
Very important for the kids to know if you have a family history of schizophrenia or any sort of psychotic disorder, you need to stay away from marijuana, not even consume it once, because it could push you over to full-blown schizophrenia, full-blown psychosis.
There are also growing concerns about what's actually in the marijuana people are buying. Licensed sellers of legal marijuana identify the percentage of THC, the mind-altering or hallucinogenic substance found in it. With illegal products sold at unlicensed smoke shops, it's impossible to know what ingredients a buyer is getting. But overall, it's a process that is working, says Evan Nissan, longtime advocate for legalization.
The pendulum swings. People have different questions and opinions as the policies change. So in my opinion, this is just sort of a natural occurrence. After legalization, we want to evaluate it. We want to make sure it's working properly.
Let's take this to our panel and find out what they have to say. Joining me is Will Jones. He's the Director of Community Engagement for the organization that's called Smart Approaches to Marijuana. Will, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Also with us is Dr. Yalda Safai. She's a medical doctor, she's a psychiatrist, and also a public health expert. Dr. Safai, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Also with us is Evan Nissan. He's the normal board member and also the president of Nissan Co., which is a cannabis PR firm. Evan, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
We appreciate it. Dr. Safai, I want to start with you on this. When you heard this comment that it did make headlines and it ended up in a lot of news feeds of Elton John saying marijuana was a huge mistake, this was the reason he suffered subsequent years of addiction to much more, much harder substances. What did you think when you heard that?
Well, I agree with him on the whole. I think marijuana legalization was a huge mistake, and I'll get into that in a second. But is it a gateway drug? I think the verdict on that is still out, and I would have to say myself, I don't know if it's a gateway drug or not. But I do agree with him that marijuana legalization was a mistake because in my own practice, I'm seeing an uptick in youth that are diagnosed with something called marijuana-induced psychosis. That means psychosis is a collection of symptoms. It's paranoia, it's delusions. If it progresses, it can progress to hallucinations. And the problem is, Lisa, the marijuana that's sold now is not the same marijuana that was on the streets 20 years ago. It's a lot more concentrated. And after the legalization of marijuana, all these dispensaries started selling very concentrated marijuana. And keep in mind, it's still a very unregulated business. So these producers can make any sort of concentration of marijuana that they want and put them on the market, unfortunately. And it's affecting our youth. My concern is always for the youth.
No, absolutely. Will, why did you get involved with the organization that, Smart Approaches to Marijuana? Tell us about that, and what did you think of Elton John's comment?
Yeah, I got started on this issue a little over a decade ago when DC was looking at legalizing marijuana, and one of the slogans, and I think we've all heard this before, is that we should regulate marijuana like alcohol. And when we look at what the alcohol industry has done, what the tobacco industry has done, and even big pharma to an extent, we see that addiction for profit industries continue to have a negative public health impact in the cost on our youth, as we just heard, and the cost on adults as well. That's something that's very concerning. That was very concerning to me, still is. And I started a campaign in DC at that time called Two is Enough, referring to alcohol and tobacco, and that we already have two recreational legal drugs that are massively advertised and promoted. We don't need to have a third. That's when I started working on this issue. And I think, I'm going to agree also with what Elton John said. I think legalization has been a huge detriment to public health when you have a substance that is addictive, that does have negative consequences with it. And again, this isn't to say that everyone does, but certainly some people do, just like everyone doesn't have problems with alcohol, but some people do. When you have an industry who gets all of their money from that, billions and billions of dollars for that, they have an incentive to have people using as much as possible, and that's going to have negative public health impacts.
All right, Evan, you've fought for many, many years to get marijuana legalized in a number of states, and you've seen this from a national perspective. When you heard Elton John's comment, what was your reaction to that?
Well, I disagree, and I'll talk a little bit about why I got involved as well in college. And I know youth came up, and the reason I got involved actually is because people were saying they were fighting the war on drugs in the youth name at the time, and all I saw was my friends getting arrested and prosecuted and their lives ruined. So that's the reason I got involved initially. And I want to say that I always have advocated, and I still advocate for an honest conversation on drugs. I'm not going to say that cannabis is harmless or incredibly harmful. In my opinion, I think that there needs to be an honest discussion about cannabis and all drugs relative to each other. But with that being said, this happened to Elton John during cannabis prohibition. So I don't think him pointing to something that happened negative in his life during a certain policy is reason to keep that policy. The fact that he experienced this, in my view, is a good reason to actually experiment with new solutions such as regulation.
We'll be right back after this.
Dr. Safai, let's talk about some of the misconceptions medically and health-wise, because we heard, I remember people were saying, well, marijuana is not addictive. It's not cocaine. It's not, you can't get addicted to it. It's a much more benign type of a substance. But now even Yale Medical School, they're saying it's physically addictive and psychologically addictive. What can you tell us about that, and what do you think about that?
Substances such as opioids and alcohol are very physically addicting. Why? Because if you don't get your fix, if you don't use, you go into withdrawal, and that withdrawal makes you feel very, very ill physically. With opioid withdrawal, you have nausea, vomiting, a lot of abdominal pain, aches and pains all over. With alcohol withdrawal, you can get a seizure, you can even die. So the withdrawal from these substances are catastrophic. Sometimes it leads to hospitalization. So that's what we call physically being addictive. Now, a substance like cocaine, the withdrawal of it won't cause you physical addiction. It causes psychological. You crave it a lot. You will feel the absence of it. Trust me, you will. And you might think about it a lot, and you might crave it. You might feel like you can't function without it, but nothing will happen to you physically if you don't use cocaine. Now, marijuana is kind of like that. It falls into the more cocaine category than it does the alcohol and opioids, because a lack of it won't make you be hospitalized. So I think there's a distinction between the two. One has catastrophic withdrawal. The other is very uncomfortable psychologically, but nothing will happen to you physically if you don't use.
So, Will, talk to me about, in terms of the image of marijuana and how you see young people feeling about it.
I think Juul is the best example of this. I've heard very often that we should regulate marijuana to keep it out of the hands of kids, that, it'll be in stores, there'll be safeguards, et cetera. And on the surface, that sounds like a very persuasive argument for legalization. But I think, again, I brought up Juul. We can look at what happens when a commercial industry is able to produce and market a product. Juul, in the space of about 5 years, almost basically one company almost single-handedly reversed rates of smoking among kids. Just one company. I think they
You're
went
talking
from
about the
evaluation of, like,
e-cigarettes called and the brand.
yes. Mhm. And they went from evaluation, I think, from like $5 billion to $15 billion in just 5 years. So this shows that still in 2024, the past few years, that's not an old example. So in recent times, we still do not have the regulative capacity to stop addiction for profit industries from marketing to kids and being effective with that marketing for kids. Again, we can just look at what happened with Juul and with vaping. And so this idea that when it's legalize that will keep it away from kids. Again, on the surface, I understand the thought process, but in practicality, when you have billions of dollars that glamorize a product, that commercialize a product, that have influencers using it on social media, you have it in magazines, you have it in different types of advertisements and things like that, that is actually far more attractive to youth and will get more youth using than the mythical drug dealer on the corner.
I of course agree that what Juul was able to do, it should have been acted on quicker. And that is a good example of something to look out for sure. But Juul has pretty much been regulated away because it was a legal product. If it was an illegal product, there's a good chance that trend would not have stopped. And I'm not saying that there's not other companies that popped up, but when something is legal and regulated, it does give you more control, even if that control in that particular instance was taken too late, which I agree with.
Dr. Safai, in terms of the kids, because what we've seen in New York, and I think it's happened in other places as well, is there was such a limited number of legal dispensaries that all of these smoke shops popped up. There's so many, what Will was talking about, you have the nearest store is a liquor store. There's multiple, like almost on every block in some neighborhoods. Well, they sold gummies. They sold things that were in candy. They were actually marijuana candies, but they were in packaging with names that sort of look like the real name, all to appeal to kids. What kind of effect do these substances have on children or even teens?
So the formulation of it, of coming in gummies and colorful, colors and stuff, it's to me, it's strategic marketing. I mean, we saw this with Juul too. They came up with flavored tobacco because it was a lot more appealing to kids. Thankfully, there's legislations to ban that, so it won't be as appealing to kids. But the different colors and the formulations of marijuana that it comes to, it's attractive to kids. The mind doesn't fully develop to the age of 25. So before that, it is very vulnerable to any outside insult. The prefrontal cortex, which is right here in the brain, that's responsible for attention and learning, isn't fully formed to age 25. So if you start using marijuana at a young age, you're going to be battling learning problems, attention problems, even impulse control problems. So it's very again, it's always concerning for the youth because their brains are so sensitive and vulnerable.
Well, what about the images in popular culture, and hip hop? I mean, look at Snoop Dogg built a whole industry around cannabis. There's many other artists across music genres and that are big influencers on youth. How concerned are you about that?
Very concerned. To me, this follows a model of industries that are looking at billions of dollars of profit. There was an article several years back in the Washington Post that estimated that if marijuana was legalized at the national level, it'd bring in more than the NFL. And so you have a lot of people that are looking at this as investments. There's a lot of money for a small minority of people that have lots of capital to get things started. They're looking at this. And I think we just need to remember, in tying this into the youth as well, it's for the tobacco industry knew this completely. You have to get people using when they're under the age of 25, usually under 20. And so when you have people that are putting this image in your mind of, you want to use, that are making it glamorous, that are making it attractive, this is for their down the road profit. And so the model of these industries, and you look at studies from the Colorado Department of Revenue, it's there with the marijuana industry as well. About 70% of the revenue comes from people that are smoking on a nearly daily basis. And so for these industries, their money comes not from the responsible occasional use, which, they're always going to say use responsibly because you have to say that. But their money comes from people that don't use responsibly. And that's what we have to look at from a public health perspective.
These are all things to look out for. I'm not saying that's not the case, but the opposite is the illicit market. The first time that somebody tried to sell me cannabis was junior high, a few lockers down. So we can't just wish cannabis or any drug away. It's a matter of what the best policy choice is. So again, I'm not saying that a lot of what you're saying is illegitimate. You know, some of it I agree with, some of it I disagree with. The corporate stuff, I do agree we need to be regulated. But I just want to remind people that we're talking about either regulation or the illicit market, not regulation or abstinence.
Dr. Safai, I feel like we've talked with you about these substances that are sold on the streets and what's in them, but what about any particular concerns to the marijuana that's being sold that we don't know what it's in or what may have been put in it?
You know, it's hard to cut marijuana with something else. It's very easy to cut cocaine with something like fentanyl. They're powders, right? But marijuana, they're leaves or there's oils and different things that you eat. So it's hard to cut them. The only cases I've seen of marijuana being laced, so to speak, is with a substance called K2 that's prevalent in the Northeast, but not so much in the West. The concern I have is the concentration of the marijuana, the THC, which is not always so clear, especially if you're buying it from the street. And even in the dispensaries, I think people don't pay too much attention about the concentration of THC in these substances. And like I mentioned in the first segment, what is being sold right now is not the same marijuana from 20 years ago. It's much more concentrated, and people who are chronically using this stuff and kids are vulnerable to a condition that I told you is marijuana-induced psychosis, which I've been seeing so much of since the legalization of marijuana. I practice in California, and since it's been legalized, I mean, left and right, I'm seeing hospitalizations and admissions to treatment centers because of the specific condition called marijuana-induced psychosis.
Dr. Safai, have there actually been real medical, bona fide medical studies about long-term use of marijuana?
They're doing a lot of studies on this. And when it comes to actually anxiety, there's still only moderate evidence that it is good for anxiety. So the psychiatric community as a whole, the consensus that marijuana is a bad thing, and we advise people not to use it. So that's where we are. But the research on it is ongoing.
Will, in terms of the community, what do you think can be done?
Continued awareness of the negative impacts of cannabis use, particularly for youth. We can never have too much public information, too much public education about that. We're working with a lot of parents now across the country who have had kids that have ended their life because from suicide, from cannabis-induced psychosis. And so, especially in Colorado and other places where the industry has been more well established. One thing that I would point out is that I think it's a false dichotomy to say that we have to have either legalization or prohibition. That's kind of how it's been framed by the industry moving forward, and I think everyone here and probably anyone watching would agree, we don't want anyone to go to jail or get an arrest record from using cannabis or marijuana, anything like that. But the alternative is not to introduce an industry that has a profit incentive to see more people use. We could introduce laws like decriminalization.
Evan, what about that?
I think look, the biggest issue for me with prohibition is people going to jail. So I mean, I understand that. I feel that. I think like we have a lot of overlapping agreement there. Where my concern is like Washington, D.C. as an example, there is decriminalization without regulation because Congress didn't allow any funds to go and to enforce, to create the regulated system. And there are still a lot of the problems with prohibition that we see there. So, I mean, I think that, I'm happy that we agree that people shouldn't be going to jail for sure.
I'm a jail psychiatrist, and now we have a new problem. People are getting arrested because they commit crimes when they have cannabis-induced psychosis. The percentage is so high. I see it all the time in jail. They're committing these crimes because they're in this altered psychotic state due to marijuana use. So we have a new problem now. They're not arresting people because of marijuana, but they're arresting them because they're committing these crimes under the influence, unfortunately.
Give us one final thought in terms of what you think would be, you'd like to see done, or what could the industry do in order to reduce the negative effects?
I think descheduling is the right move, and I think allowing the states to properly regulate this and learn from each other, which they're currently doing, is the right move. I think we're on the right path, generally speaking. There's still a lot more to do, and there's a lot to be learned from both what has worked and not worked from the various states. But I think this is a state level laboratory of policy type of issue.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Street Soldiers on new questions about marijuana. You can watch the show again on our Fox 5 NY YouTube page and the Fox Local app, where you can find many of our episodes. Remember, use your mind. It's your best weapon. I'm Lisa Evers. Let's push for peace, love, and justice for all.